The Arizona Territory in the summer of 1879 held no mercy for man or beast. Thomas Morgan pressed his weathered hand against the canyon wall, feeling the red sandstone burn through his calloused palm even as the sun began its descent toward the western rim. 3 years of sobriety had sharpened his senses, but nothing could dull the memory of why he'd come to this godforsaken place. At 45, Thomas had learned that running from your past was like trying to outride your own shadow. The bottle had failed him, the war had broken him, and now solitude in these endless canyons was his only companion. His modest camp lay hidden among the rocks above. Nothing more than a bedroll, some jerky, and the tools needed to scrape silver from stubborn stone. It wasn't much of a life, but it was honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls long before Thomas spotted the riders. 3 men, moving with the purposeful gait of hunters who'd caught a scent. His blood chilled as he recognized the lead rider's silhouette against the harsh light. Silas Drake, a name he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Drake had been a sergeant in Thomas's unit during the war, a man whose ambition outweighed his honor. When Confederate forces had offered Drake gold to reveal Union troop movements, he'd taken the deal without hesitation. 23 good men had died in that ambush, including Thomas's younger brother Samuel. The official report called it a tactical error. Thomas knew better. Now Drake had found him, and the cold smile on the man's face suggested this wasn't a social call. Thomas checked his Colt Model 1873, its familiar weight both comforting and insufficient. 4 bullets against 3 men weren't favorable odds, but Thomas had survived worse with less. "Thomas Morgan," Drake called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of an old friend. "Been looking all over creation for you." Thomas remained silent, positioned behind cover with a clear view of the canyon floor. Drake's companions spread out, professional in their movements. Bounty hunters by their look. Men who value gold over conscience. "Now don't be unfriendly," Drake continued, dismounting with theatrical casualness. "We've got business to discuss. Profitable business for a man with your particular skills." The lies came as easily as breathing to Drake. Thomas remembered how the man could charm a rattlesnake out of its skin when it suited his purposes. But charm hadn't saved those 23 soldiers, and it wouldn't save Thomas now. A shadow moved among the rocks below, and Thomas tensed. Someone else was in the canyon. A flash of dark hair and buckskin caught his eye, then vanished again. Apache, by the look of it. Probably drawn by the sound of voices, curious about strangers in their ancestral hunting grounds. "I know you can hear me, Morgan." Drake's patience was beginning to fray. "Make this easy on yourself. Come down, and we'll talk like civilized men." Thomas's grip tightened on his revolver. Whatever Drake wanted, it wasn't conversation. The man's eyes held the same cold calculation they'd shown the night before that fatal ambush. Some men were born predators, and time only sharpened their teeth. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight, making every breath taste of dust and desperation. Sweat stung Thomas's wounded shoulder where a bullet had grazed him during his escape from town 3 days ago. He'd known this day would come eventually. A man couldn't run forever, not from someone like Drake, who never forgot a grudge or abandoned the profitable scheme. Movement caught his eye again. The Apache was closer now, working through the rocks with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh country. Thomas couldn't tell if it was friend or enemy approaching, but in his experience, any enemy of Drake's was worth considering as an ally. The canyon walls seemed to pulse with trapped heat and tension. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice echoing like a warning across the stone. Thomas wiped sweat from his eyes and prepared for the fight that had been 3 years in the coming. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't run again. He was tired of being prey. "Snake." The voice pierced the canyon air like a rifle shot. Rattlesnake, between your legs. Thomas's blood turned to ice as he looked down, expecting to see death coiled at his feet. Instead, he found his lariat hanging from his belt. The sun-darkened rope twisted in a way that, in the harsh glare and his own exhaustion, did indeed resemble a serpent ready to strike. The woman who'd given the warning emerged from the shadows with fluid grace, her Apache features sharp with intelligence and wariness. She held a hunting knife with the easy confidence of someone who'd used it to survive, not just to threaten. Her buckskin clothing was travel-worn but well-maintained, and her eyes held the kind of depth that spoke of hardships endured and overcome. But her warning had cost them both dearly. Drake's head snapped up like a hunting dog catching scent. "Found you, Morgan." His voice carried the triumph of a man who'd been patient long enough. The crack of his rifle split the desert air, and chips of sandstone exploded near Thomas's position. Thomas shoved the Apache woman behind cover as bullets ricocheted off the ancient stone. Her warning might have been about a false snake, but the danger surrounding them was real enough. He rolled to his knees, brought his Colt up, and fired twice in quick succession. His first shot caught one of Drake's men in the shoulder, spinning him around like a child's toy. The second bullet found another bounty hunter's thigh, dropping him to the canyon floor with a scream that echoed off the walls. The Apache woman moved with surprising speed and deadly purpose. Her knife flew through the air with perfect accuracy, burying itself in the wounded hunter's arm as he tried to raise his pistol. The man's weapon clattered away across the rocks, useless as his strength fled with his blood. "This way," Thomas called, already moving toward higher ground. His military training kicked in, reading the terrain and finding the path that would give them the best advantage. The woman followed without question, her movements as silent as his own were careful. Drake's voice followed them up through the rocks, filled with the kind of rage that came from having easy prey slip away. "I'll find you, Morgan. I'll find you, Morgan. I've got men scattered all over this territory. You can't run forever." The words stung because Thomas knew they were true. Drake had always been thorough, and 3 years had given him plenty of time to prepare. But for now, they'd gained breathing room, and in the desert, breathing room was worth its weight in silver. They climbed higher, using a narrow passage that opened onto a hidden ledge overlooking the canyon. Only when they were safely out of rifle range did Thomas allow himself to examine his wounded shoulder. The bullet had carved a painful groove through muscle, but the bleeding was manageable. The Apache woman watched him with careful eyes, keeping distance between them despite their shared danger. Thomas noticed the way she favored her left side and the dark stain spreading across her buckskin shirt. "You're hurt," he said, pulling a clean bandana from his pocket. His voice was gentler than he'd used in conversation for months. "Not your concern," she replied, but swayed slightly on her feet. Pride was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. Thomas approached slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I was a scout in the war. Patched up worse than this." When she didn't back away, he carefully examined her wound. "Bullet just grazed you. Lucky." His touch was surprisingly gentle for such weathered hands, and she studied his face as he worked. "Why does Drake hunt you?" she asked, her English accented but clear. Thomas's expression hardened like cooling iron. "Long story." "Why is he after you?" She hesitated, then reached into a pouch at her waist and produced a worn piece of hide with markings etched into its surface. "Map to ancient silver mine." Thomas sensed there was more to the story, but he understood the value of secrets in a land where information could mean the difference between life and death. "Name's Thomas Morgan. Yours?" "My people call me Raven," she answered after a moment's consideration. As he finished bandaging her wound, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: responsibility for another person's welfare. It was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "Those men won't give up easily. Raven, There's a town 2 days' ride from here. Redemption. I know the sheriff there. Suspicion edged her voice. Why help me? Thomas looked toward the canyon where Drake's voice still echoed with threats and promises of violence. Maybe I'm tired of seeing Drake leave bodies behind him? The dunes, the sun painted the desert in shades of amber and copper as Thomas and Raven made their careful way through terrain that seemed determined to kill anything foolish enough to cross it. Thomas had chosen their route with the eye of a man who'd learned to read danger in every shadow and opportunity in every rock formation. 3 years of solitude had made him cautious, but Raven's presence reminded him of what it meant to be responsible for more than just his own survival. They traveled in silence for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts and watching for signs of pursuit. When they did speak, it was in the careful way of two people who'd learned that trust was a luxury that could get you killed in this unforgiving country. As they rested in the shade of a towering red rock formation, Thomas studied the map Raven had shown him. The markings were clearly Apache, etched with the kind of precision that spoke of sacred knowledge passed down through generations. But there was something about the way she held it, something in her eyes when she looked at those ancient symbols, that suggested this map meant more to her than just a location of silver. Your father's work? Thomas asked quietly, handing the hide back to her. Raven nodded, carefully returning it to her pouch. He was war chief. Collected many things from raids. Weapons, silver, secrets. She paused, studying Thomas's face as if deciding how much truth he could handle. White man's weapons. Army rifles, ammunition. Enough to arm many warriors. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. And Drake knows this? Suspects. Silver mine real, but weapons more valuable. Her voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. Wrong hands, much blood follows. The pieces began falling into place for Thomas. Drake's determination, his willingness to hire bounty hunters, his mention of having men throughout the territory. This wasn't just about settling old scores from the war. This was about something far more dangerous. They made camp that night beneath an overhang that provided shelter from both the wind and prying eyes. Thomas kept the fire small, more for warmth than light, and they shared jerky and water in the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to appreciate simple necessities. Tell me about your father, Thomas said eventually. Raven stared into the small flames, her expression softening with memory. Great warrior. Fought cavalry many times, always returned with weapons taken from soldiers. Said someday our people would need them to survive what was coming. She looked up at Thomas. He was right. But when I was captured by raiders, when I returned months later, my people said I was unclean. Cast out, Thomas understood rejection by one's own people. The bottle had cost him his family, his position, his self-respect. So you're protecting a cache of weapons for people who won't even speak to you? Her eyes flashed with fierce pride. For the land. For my father's honor. These weapons in Drake's hands mean war with Mexico. More Apache die. More everyone die. Thomas nodded slowly. He'd seen enough war to know how quickly violence could spread once it started. 3 years I've been running from what I did in the war. Maybe it's time to run towards something instead. They took turns standing watch through the night, each lost in their own thoughts about the morning that would bring them closer to redemption and whatever waited there. Thomas found himself thinking about Sheriff William Blackwood, a man he'd served with and trusted. If anyone could help them navigate the dangerous waters ahead, it would be Blackwood. But as dawn broke over the desert, revealing another day of punishing heat and treacherous travel, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. Drake was a patient man when it served his purposes, and patient men were often the most dangerous. Raven seemed to sense his unease. You doubt your friend the sheriff? Thomas checked his weapons and prepared to mount his horse. I doubt everyone until they prove otherwise. It's kept me alive this long." They rode toward redemption under a sky that promised another day of brutal heat, each carrying secrets that could reshape the balance of power in the territory. Behind them, dust clouds on the horizon suggested they weren't traveling alone. Redemption appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered buildings shimmering in the brutal afternoon heat. Thomas felt his shoulders tense as they approached the town's dusty main street. 3 years since he'd walked among civilized people. 3 years since he'd faced the temptation that waited in every saloon and the judgment that lived in every sideways glance. The town wore its frontier roughness like a badge of honor. False-fronted buildings lined the main street, their paint faded and their boards warped by the relentless sun. Men paused in their business to stare as Thomas and Raven passed, their eyes lingering on her with undisguised hostility that made Thomas's jaw clench. "Stay close," he murmured to Raven. "Towns like this don't take kindly to Apache." The sheriff's office sat at the heart of the main street, its solid construction and barred windows speaking to the kind of justice this territory required. Thomas tied their horses to the hitching post, his hand instinctively checking his colt's position as they approached the door. Sheriff William Blackwood looked up from his desk as they entered, surprise flashing across his weathered features before settling into what Thomas recognized as a calculated expression. The smile that spread across Blackwood's face was warm enough, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas Morgan," Blackwood drawled, rising to shake hands. "Thought you were dead." "Not yet," Thomas replied, studying his old friend's face. Something had changed in William Blackwood. Where once there had been the steady reliability of a good soldier, now there was something hungry lurking behind the badge. They exchanged memories of campaigns fought and battles won, but Thomas noticed how Blackwood's gaze repeatedly drifted to Raven with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. The sheriff was calculating something, weighing options like a merchant considering a profitable trade. "Need a place to rest," Thomas explained. "Got men on trail." Blackwood nodded with what seemed like genuine concern. "Drake, right? Heard he's been asking after you around these parts. Dangerous man, that one." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of helpful authority. "You can stay at the Frontier Hotel. I'll keep an eye out for trouble." As they left the sheriff's office, Thomas felt the bitter taste of betrayal settling in his mouth. 3 years of solitude had sharpened his instincts, and every one of them was screaming warnings about William Blackwood. The man had changed, or perhaps Thomas had finally developed the wisdom to see what had always been there. The Frontier Hotel was typical of its kind, clean enough to keep the bedbugs at bay, sturdy enough to stop a bullet, and discreet enough to ask no questions about its guests. Thomas paid for a room with silver coins that drew interested glances from the desk clerk, then led Raven upstairs to what passed for sanctuary in this unforgiving country. "Rest," he told her. "I need to learn more about our situation." That night, while Raven slept fitfully on the narrow bed, Thomas slipped out through the back window and into the alley behind the rusty nail saloon. The sounds of piano music and drunken laughter spilled through the batwing doors, accompanied by the smell of whiskey that hit him like a physical blow. Hidden in the shadows, Thomas heard voices that made his blood run cold. Sheriff Blackwood emerged from the saloon's back door, followed by a figure that Thomas recognized with sick certainty. "Silas Drake. Morgan's at the hotel," Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man conducting routine business. "Got that Apache woman with him?" Drake's response was sharp with interest. "Does she have the map?" "Must do. Why else would Morgan protect her?" Blackwood pulled out a flask and took a drink. "Question is, what's your play here, Silas?" Thomas pressed closer to the wall, straining to hear every word. "That map leads to more than silver," Drake explained. his voice taking on the tone Thomas remembered from their army days when the man was planning something particularly ruthless. Word is there's a cache of weapons hidden there. Army rifles, ammunition, enough to outfit a small army. What do you need an arsenal for? Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. General, Vasquez across the border is paying top dollar for quality weapons. With what he's offering, we could retire like kings. Drake's laughter was cold as winter wind. All we need is that Apache woman's cooperation. Thomas backed away from the voices, his mind racing. Drake wasn't just settling a personal score or hunting bounty. He was planning to sell weapons to a Mexican warlord, risking a border war that would spill blood across both sides of the Rio Grande. And Sheriff William Blackwood, a man Thomas had once trusted with his life, was willing to help him do it. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet wound. In a world where a man's word was often all he had, discovering that an old friend had sold his honor for Mexican gold was like losing faith in the sunrise itself. Thomas slipped back into the hotel, his mind already working on their next move. Redemption had proven to be no refuge at all. If anything, they'd walk straight into the spider's web, and the spider was already tightening the strands around them. The rusty nail saloon breathed whiskey, sweat, and broken dreams into the desert night. Thomas stood outside its bat-wing doors, feeling 3 years of sobriety wavering like a flame in a hurricane. The smell hit him first, that familiar combination of alcohol and desperation that had nearly destroyed him after the war. His throat constricted with remembered thirst, but his mind remained focused on the immediate danger. Inside, the piano jangled a discordant tune, while cowboys and drifters sought liquid courage at the bottom of their glasses. Thomas pushed through the doors, acutely aware of every bottle behind the bar, every glass raised in toast, every drop of amber poison that had once promised to wash away his guilt. The bartender glanced up from polishing glasses. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Coffee," Thomas said, ignoring the mocking glances from nearby tables. In a place where men measured their worth by how much whiskey they could hold, ordering coffee marked him as either a coward or a fool. As he waited, trying to appear casual while listening for information about Drake's movements, a group of cowboys at a corner table began their own form of entertainment. Their voices carried across the saloon with the deliberate volume of men who wanted to be overheard. "Heard tell there's an Apache squaw staying at the hotel," one of them said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Riding with some drifter who thinks he's too good to drink with honest men." Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but he forced himself to remain still. Starting a fight would only draw attention. They couldn't afford. Another cowboy laughed, the sound ugly in the smoky air. "Maybe I should pay her a visit. Show her what real men are like." The words shattered Thomas's restraint like a hammer on glass. He moved with the fluid violence of a man who'd survived too many battles, smashing the speaker's face into the wooden table with a sound like breaking kindling. The others lunged forward, but Thomas was a whirlwind of precise brutality. An elbow to a throat, a boot to a knee, a fist connecting with jawbone. The fight ended as quickly as it began. 4 men sprawled unconscious on the saloon floor while Thomas stood unscathed, his knuckles bleeding and his eyes cold as winter stone. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, suddenly reassessing this quiet man who ordered coffee instead of whiskey. As Thomas turned to leave, movement caught his eye near the bar. A genuine rattlesnake, disturbed by the commotion, had emerged from beneath the wooden structure where it had probably been sleeping off the day's heat. The serpent coiled, rattles buzzing, ready to strike at the nearest threat. Before it could launch itself at Thomas, a knife sliced through the air, pinning the snake to the wall with deadly accuracy. Raven stood in the doorway, another blade already balanced in her hand, ready to throw. "Now I save you from real snake," she said simply, her eyes taking in the unconscious men and understanding immediately what had happened. Back at the hotel, Thomas barricaded the door and checked his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. "We leave before dawn," he told Raven. "Blackwood's working with Drake." Raven nodded grimly, settling her own weapons within easy reach. "I know place 3 days' ride." "Safe place." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. "What's really on that map, Raven?" "The whole truth this time." She met his gaze steadily, weighing her options one final time before deciding that trust was a risk worth taking. "Weapons cache. My father hidden an old silver mine. Army rifles, ammunition, enough to start war or stop one. Why protect it? Your tribe cast you out." Her eyes flashed with fierce determination. "Not for tribe. For father's honor. For land. These weapons in wrong hands mean war. More Apache die. More everyone die." Thomas understood. Despite everything she'd suffered, she was still fighting to protect a land that had rejected her, just as he had once led men through territory that never wanted them there. Their moment of understanding was shattered by the sound of boots on the hotel stairs. Heavy boots moving with purpose. "They come," Raven whispered, already moving toward the window. Gunfire erupted as they escaped into the night, bullets splintering the wooden frame around them. Thomas returned fire, his muzzle flash illuminating Drake's men closing in from multiple directions. They'd been herded into a trap, and only speed could save them now. They ran for the stables through streets suddenly alive with hostile shadows. Behind them, Drake's voice rose above the gunfire, promising rewards for their capture and death for their resistance. Thomas helped Raven onto a horse, then mounted another. They thundered out of redemption under a star-filled sky, the town's lights fading behind them like the dying embers of a campfire. Only when the desert had swallowed the sounds of pursuit did Thomas realized that Raven was slumping in her saddle, blood darkening her side where a bullet had found its mark. The hunt was far from over, and now they were riding deeper into the wilderness with fresh wounds and dwindling supplies. But they were alive, and in this harsh country, sometimes that was victory enough. For 3 days, they pushed through terrain that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to cross it. Thomas had traveled harsh country before, but never with a wounded companion whose life depended on reaching sanctuary before infection claimed her. Raven, despite the bullet wound in her side and the fever that came with it, guided them through hidden paths that only her people knew. Ancient trails carved by countless generations of Apache moving through their ancestral homeland. On the second night, her fever spiked dangerously high. Thomas held her upright in the saddle as she drifted between consciousness and delirium, speaking in Apache and calling out names of people who existed only in memory. He wiped her burning forehead with precious water from his canteen and whispered encouragements that the wind carried away across the endless desert. "Hold on," he urged, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. Just a few more miles, when dawn revealed a small ranch nestled against rocky hills. Thomas felt relief wash over him like cool water. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, suggesting life and hope in this desolate country. He approached cautiously, Raven barely conscious in his arms, prepared for anything from a welcome to a rifle shot. The door opened to reveal a tall gray-haired man holding a shotgun with the easy familiarity of long practice. His clothes were clean but worn, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to trust strangers easily. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded, his weapon steady and his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thomas Morgan, looking for Dr. Ethan Harrison." The shotgun lowered slightly. "I'm Harrison. What's your business?" "Woman needs a doctor." "Heard you were one." Harrison's eyes took in Raven's condition and Thomas's exhausted state, reading the desperation and genuine concern in the younger man's face. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped aside. Bring her in. Inside the cabin, Harrison transformed from cautious rancher to skilled physician with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. His hands were gentle but sure as he examined Raven's wound, cleaning away dried blood and assessing the damage with professional detachment. Bullets out, but infection set in, he explained, already preparing instruments and medications. She's strong, though. Might make it if we can break the fever. Thomas collapsed into a chair, the weight of sleepless nights and constant vigilance finally catching up with him. He'd been running on determination and coffee for days, holding himself together through sheer willpower. Drake's after you, Harrison said, not asking but stating a fact. Thomas looked up sharply. You know him? Harrison's weathered face darkened like a thundercloud. Everyone in these parts knows Silas Drake. Butchered an Apache village 2 years back. Claimed they were hostiles preparing for war. But word is they were unarmed families trying to survive on government rations. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd known Drake was ruthless, but the casual massacre of innocents revealed a depth of evil that made their current situation even more dangerous. He's planning something worse now, Thomas explained, telling Harrison about Drake's weapon-running scheme and Sheriff Blackwood's betrayal. Harrison listened with growing alarm. If General Vasquez gets those weapons, he'll sweep across the border like wildfire. The army won't be able to stop him without starting a full-scale war. For 2 days, Raven drifted between consciousness and fever dreams while Thomas and Harrison prepared. The ranch for the attack they both knew was coming. They dug rifle pits, set traps, and stockpiled ammunition like soldiers preparing for a siege. While they worked, Harrison sent his ranch hand, a young man named Billy, with sealed messages to former soldiers scattered throughout the territory. Men who still remember what honor means, he explained to Thomas. Men who owe me or you their lives. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You kept track? Harrison's weathered face cracked into a rare smile. Doctor's habit. I remember every man I saved, and those I couldn't. On the second evening, as they sat on the porch watching the desert paint itself in shades of gold and crimson, Harrison asked the question Thomas had been dreading. Why fight? This isn't your war. Thomas stared into the distance, seeing ghosts in the failing light. Been running for 3 years. Doesn't wash the blood off. The bottle didn't either, I expect, Harrison observed quietly. Thomas looked up sharply. How do you know? Recognized the look. Had it myself after the war. Harrison reached into a cabinet, removing a small flask of fine silver. He placed it on the table between them like a challenge. Test for you. Right, there's the best whiskey in the territory. Thomas stared at the flask, feeling its pull like a physical force. 3 years of sobriety wavered before him, all his hard-won strength suddenly fragile as spun glass. The amber liquid inside promised forgetfulness, numbness, escape from the weight of responsibility and guilt. If we're going to die tomorrow, Harrison continued, watching Thomas's face carefully, might as well face it with something to warm the blood. Thomas's hand moved toward the flask, then stopped. With deliberate slowness, he pushed it back toward Harrison. If we die tomorrow, I'll do it with a clear head. Harrison smiled, returning the untouched flask to the cabinet. Good. Drunk men make poor shots. That night, as Thomas stood watch under stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The quiet pride of a man who'd faced his worst demon and walked away victorious. Before dawn painted the eastern sky with fingers of rose and gold. Harrison's ranch hand Billy returned with news that made Thomas's blood run cold. Drake was coming with 20 men, well-armed and determined to finish what he'd started in that canyon days ago. Thomas stood on the ranch house porch, watching the horizon brighten with the knowledge that this day would likely be his last. 20 to 1 weren't odds any sane man would face, but sometimes sanity was a luxury a man couldn't afford. Raven appeared beside him, pale but standing, her fever finally broken and her eyes clear with purpose. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone still healing, but her spirit burned as bright as ever. "You should rest," Thomas said, though he was grateful for her company in what might be their final hour. "We'll rest when we're dead," she replied, checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. Not today. As the sun cleared the mountains, riders appeared in the distance like dark omens against the brightening sky. Thomas counted them carefully. 20 men, just as Billy had reported. Too many to fight, too determined to evade. "Harrison, get your men ready," Thomas said, making his decision with the calm acceptance of a man who'd finally stopped running. "I'm going out to meet them. 20 against 1? That's suicide." Thomas checked his Colt one final time, feeling its familiar weight like an old friend's handshake. "Not if I choose the battlefield." He rode out alone to meet Drake's force, knowing that behind him Harrison and Raven had positioned themselves with rifles, covering his approach from concealed positions among the rocks. It was a desperate plan, but desperation sometimes bred the kind of reckless courage that one battles against impossible. Odds. Drake halted his men at the edge of Harrison's property, his face wearing the satisfied smile of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "Morgan," he called across the dusty ground. Finally stopped running, Thomas dismounted, standing in the open ground between the two forces like a gunfighter facing his destiny. "This ends today, Drake. You, the Apache woman, and that map," Drake countered, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Or we burn everything and everyone." Thomas smiled with genuine amusement. "You always were too arrogant to recognize a trap." Movement on the surrounding ridges revealed the fruits of Harrison's messages. Former soldiers, ranchers, and townspeople who remembered what honor meant had answered the call. Men who'd served with Thomas or been saved by Harrison's medical skills emerged from concealment, their weapons trained on Drake's suddenly outnumbered force. Drake's confident expression cracked like dried mud. "You think these farmers scare me? I've got men throughout this territory." Came a new voice that made Thomas smile with genuine warmth. Charlie Two Feathers, a Comanche warrior Thomas had saved from a cavalry raid gone wrong, rode forward with 5 Apache braves. The sight of them made Thomas remember why he'd once believed in justice and honor before the war, and the bottle had nearly destroyed his faith. "Your men in Canyon not breathing anymore," Charlie said in his careful English. Drake's advantage evaporated like morning dew, but his hatred only intensified with his desperation. The mask of civilization fell away, revealing the snarling animal beneath. "You ruined everything, Morgan." Drake's voice cracked with rage. "The promotion that should have been mine, the recognition, the future I deserved." "You betrayed your own men," Thomas replied, his voice steady as granite. "Left them to die for Confederate gold. A necessary sacrifice." Drake snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Just like you will be." Drake's hand flashed to his gun with the speed of a man fighting for his life. But Thomas had anticipated the move. His Colt clearing leather first in a motion practiced 10,000 times in lonely camps and desert dawns. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Drake collapsed. Clutching his shoulder, Thomas stood over the fallen man, his smoking revolver steady in his hand. "I'm not like you, Drake. I won't execute an unarmed enemy." Sheriff Blackwood and 2 deputy U.S. Marshals rode in at that moment, summoned by Harrison's foresight and testimony. Faced with overwhelming evidence and witnesses, Blackwood surrendered, confessing his role in Drake's weapon-running scheme with the bitter resignation of a man who'd sold his soul for Mexican gold. "The territorial judge will be through next week," one marshal explained as they loaded the prisoners into a wagon. "They'll hang for conspiracy and treason." As Drake was led away in chains, he spat at Thomas's feet with the impotent rage of a man who'd lost everything. "You're still the same fool, Morgan." Some men aren't meant to be saved. Thomas watched them go, feeling no satisfaction, only a hollow relief that the long hunt was finally over. The ghosts of 23 soldiers would sleep easier now, knowing their betrayer would face justice at last. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood on the porch of his new cabin on Harrison's land, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The weapons from Raven's father's cache had been distributed among friendly Apache bands for protection, with her blessing and the territorial governor's grudging approval. It was better to have them in the hands of people defending their ancestral lands than rotting in some government warehouse or falling into the wrong hands. Again, the silver mine itself had been sealed with dynamite, its entrance marked only on a map that Raven had burned after memorizing its contents. Some treasures were too dangerous to leave accessible to men like Drake, and some secrets were better kept buried in the desert stone. Thomas had found work that suited him, tracking rustlers, guiding supply wagons through dangerous territory, and helping Harrison tend to the sick and wounded who found their way to the remote ranch. It was honest work that kept his hands busy, and his mind focused on the present rather than the ghosts of the past. The cabin was simple but comfortable, built with his own hands from local timber and native stone. It had a good well, a small corral for his horses, and a view that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Most importantly, it had no saloons within 50 miles, which made the daily choice of sobriety that much easier to maintain. Harrison had proven to be more than just an employer. He'd become the kind of friend Thomas had thought he'd lost the capacity to have. They worked together in comfortable silence most days, shared coffee on the porch most evenings, and respected each other's need for solitude when the weight of memory grew too heavy to bear in company. Raven joined him on the porch as the stars began to emerge from the deepening sky. Her steps were silent on the wooden boards, a skill learned in childhood and refined by years of survival in hostile territory. The wound in her side had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar that she wore like a badge of honor. "You stay," she said, though it wasn't quite a question. Her English had improved during their time together, but she still chose her words carefully, giving each one the weight it deserved. Thomas nodded, surprising himself with how easily the admission came. "First place that's felt right in a long time. Because no snakes?" she asked, and he caught the hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. It had become a private joke between them, that false warning that had saved both their lives by bringing them together in that canyon. "Because I'm not running anymore," he replied, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. Her skin was warm and calloused from honest work, and her grip was steady as the North Star. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the desert transform under starlight into something mysterious and beautiful. Thomas had learned that the harshest country often held the greatest beauty for those patient enough to see it, just as the most difficult journeys often led to the most worthwhile destinations. Inside their cabin, hanging on the wall like a talisman, was the coiled lariat that had once been mistaken for a rattlesnake. It served as a reminder that sometimes what we fear most leads us exactly where we need to be, and that warning spoken in kindness can save more than just lives. A rider appeared on the distant trail, dust rising behind him in the moonlight. Harrison's ranch hand Billy, returning from town with supplies and news. As he approached, Thomas could see the urgency in the young man's posture. The way he urged his horse toward the ranch buildings. Thomas and Raven exchanged a glance, both recognizing the signs of trouble brewing. Billy brought news of bandits raiding neighboring ranches, of cattle rustlers going bold, and of rumors that more men like Drake were moving through the territory with schemes that would bring violence to peaceful communities. "Looks like our quiet life might not stay quiet much longer," Thomas observed, though he felt no inclination to run from whatever challenges lay ahead. Raven squeezed his hand, her grip conveying understanding and shared resolve. "Good. Quiet is overrated." Thomas smiled, thinking of the 23 soldiers whose deaths had haunted him for so long. They would have approved of using the skills they died protecting to defend others who couldn't defend themselves. There was honor in that kind of work, purpose that gave meaning to the long years of guilt and self-destruction. As Billy reached the ranch and began unsaddling his horse with the efficient movements of a man bearing important news, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war: anticipation for tomorrow. Not the dread that had driven him to the bottle, not the fear that had kept him running, but genuine curiosity about what challenges and opportunities the next day might bring. The desert stretched before them, harsh and beautiful and full of possibilities. There would be more battles to fight, more wrongs to set right, and more people who needed the kind of help that only experienced fighters could provide. Thomas Morgan had spent 3 years learning how to survive alone. Now he would learn how to live as part of something larger than himself. The coiled rope on the wall caught a stray beam of starlight through the window, its familiar shape no longer mistaken for danger, but recognized for what it had always been: a tool for honest work, strong enough to bear weight and flexible enough to adapt to whatever task required its service. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with a warning shouted in desperation by a stranger who becomes a friend. Sometimes the things we run from circle back to become the things we run toward. And sometimes, in the harsh beauty of the frontier, a man discovers that redemption isn't a place you find on a map. It's a choice you make every morning when you decide who you want to be. Thomas Morgan had made his choice, and the desert wind carried it away into the star-filled night like a promise he intended to keep.